Well, hello, viewers and listeners to the CHP Talks this week. We are so honored and privileged to have with us as our guest the Honourable A. Brian Peckford, PC. Brian, before I go further on, is the only remaining signatory of the Constitution Act of 1982, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So I'm going to give you a little bit about Brian's background. He was born in Whitburn, Newfoundland in 1966. He graduated with a BA in education from Memorial University in Newfoundland. Later did postgraduate work in English literature and education psychology. He taught high school in Springdale, Newfoundland, and in 1972, he entered provincial politics. He was elected at the age of 29 to be the first progressive conservative MHA, and that's, for those who don't know, that's the member of the House of Assembly of Newfoundland. Later that year, he became special and parliamentary assistant to the then Premier, Frank Moores. He served as Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, Minister of Mines and Energy, and while Minister of Mines and Energy, also served as Minister of Rural Development and Northern Affairs. Quite a portfolio. In March 1979, Brian won the Progressive Conservative leadership and became the third Premier of the province of Newfoundland since Confederation. At the age of 36, he was the youngest First Minister of Newfoundland since the first Prime Minister, Philip Little, in 1855. Brian is known as a strong advocate of provincial rights, and that was manifested in his efforts to gain some control of the revenues of the newly developing offshore oil and gas resources, and that culminated in the Atlantic Accord. Some of you will remember that process. Brian was involved also, and this is what we really want to focus on today, in the constitutional patriation process of the early 1980s, leading to the Constitution Act of 1982 and our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It was Newfoundland's proposal that led to the breakthrough, and Brian is the only living First Minister of that constitutional process. Mr. Peckford retired from politics in March 1989 and began a consulting company with his wife, Carol, assisting companies in both Europe and North America. He's written 2 books. The last, Someday the Sun Will Shine, and what's the other? Someday the Sun Will Shine, and the Have Not Will Be No More. It's a very interesting title, and that was a Globe and Mail bestseller in 2012. Brian has received awards as an outstanding young Canadian, the Outstanding Contribution Award from the Newfoundland Ocean Industries Association. He was sworn to the Privy Council by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth in 1982. Well, and Brian has conducted inquiries on behalf of the British Columbia government and the government of Canada. He retired in 2001, presently lives in Parksville, British Columbia on the island. And the interesting thing, or what I want to thank you for, Brian, is coming out of retirement to get involved in the process going on today, the diminution or the reduction of our rights and freedoms by certain acts of both the federal and provincial government. So, number one, thank you so much for joining us today. We feel really honored and privileged to have you with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And as a citizen of British Columbia, as I said to you earlier before we start recording, I'm trying to ensure that as the requests come in for me to speak or to be interviewed like this morning, that I give my first priority to the province that I live in. I think I have a civic duty to, first, as a citizen of this province, to ensure that I do my part in informing people of British Columbia of my position as it relates to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, having been an architect of that and having actually some words that the Newfoundland delegation inserted into that very sacred piece of law, that very sacred document, which all Canadians should be proud of.
Well, we're so grateful for your work there, and again for coming on the scene now to give, shed light and wisdom on the things that are going on in our country. The last 20 months have been very troubling to most of us, I think, in one way or another. And of course, people have come to different conclusions about about things. And those in the middle, the RCMP, mayors, and others in between, those in the healthcare system, have really become conflicted in terms of their responsibility, both to the charter, to the citizens, and then, of course, to those writing these edicts. And we've seen them in British Columbia, and they go up and down, they change. So you want to give us a broad brush view of how you see what's going on today in the country?
Yes, I do. I thank you very much for the opportunity. The Canadians should know that we had no written Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We had no Bill of Rights like they had in the United States from 1867 to 1960. It's a long time. So our country got formed in 1867, but the act that formed our country, the 1867 B&A Act, didn't talk about individual rights and freedoms. It wasn't until people started to talk about it after the Second World War in the politics of Canada, but nobody finally did anything about it until John Diefenbaker, Prime Minister John Diefenbaker in 1960, introduced the Bill of Rights and it became a act of the Parliament of Canada. And so that was the first time that individual rights, not group rights, not organizational rights, not government rights, but rights of the individual became enshrined in any document in Canada. Very important for Canadians to remember. However, after saying that, there were two drawbacks to the Bill of Rights, which people recognized. And that was, one, it only applied to federal law. And as most Canadians know, federal law, it means applies to federal laws, just to things that come under the federal government. And we are a federation. We're not a unitary state like France or England. The powers are shared between the central government, the federal government, and the provinces. And therefore, it didn't cover everybody. It didn't cover all law. Number two, it was a federal act of parliament and could easily be changed. And so between 1960 and 1981, there were a lot of musings by a lot of people in Canada about doing something to cover all Canadians and all law as related to rights and freedoms for individuals, and to put it in the Constitution so it would be away from easy change. And that culminated in 1981 in negotiations between the premiers and the Prime Minister to try to, first of all, bring the Constitution home from London so we wouldn't have to amend our Constitution anymore with going to London. That's what patriation means, making sure that our Constitution was all in Canada and all changes would have to be done just by Canadians. And two, at the same time, to have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, to expand and enlarge upon the Bill of Rights that Mr. Diefenbaker passed, make it more permanent and make it far away in the Constitution so it couldn't be easily changed. That was accomplished in 1981 after a lot of talk for 17 months. The negotiations went on for 17 months, and halfway through the negotiations, the Prime Minister of Canada, Mr. Trudeau, left the table and said he couldn't get a deal with the provinces. We were too difficult to deal with. It ended up in the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Supreme Court of Canada, and we have to remember this is very important because we don't know if it's true today. The judges of the Supreme Court were friends of the law first, friends of the government second. Once they were appointed, they're supposed to be independent. A lot of people question whether that's true today. But in that time, many people and many of those judges knew the Prime Minister very, very well. But when they looked at what he was trying to do on his own, without involving the provinces, when he left the table, they came down very tough and very hard and very clear that what the Prime Minister was trying to do was unconstitutional. And so he had to come back to the table again and negotiate. And then November 3rd and 4th and 5th, 1981, 40 years ago last month, we finally reached a deal as a result of a proposal that I presented on behalf of the provinces to the federal government on the 5th of the 3 days of the conference. And we got the Patriation Agreement and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So that's a little bit of history because I think the history is very important. It between 1867 and 1960, when we had no written Charter of Rights and Freedoms, what guided us on individual rights and freedoms was British common law and custom or convention that had grown up over the decades from the time we became a country. And interestingly enough, it was that custom and convention that persuaded the Supreme Court of Canada that what the Prime Minister was doing was unconstitutional. So our Constitution today, as we sit here, is the BNA Act of 1867, the new 1982 Constitution Act of 1982, plus custom and convention. So a lot of it is written, some of it is still unwritten, and the courts still refer to custom as convention as being part of our Constitution. In other words, if tomorrow you had to go to court and initiate a constitutional discussion about an act or about something that the governments did to you and violated your individual rights, the court would likely, first of all, look at the Bill of Rights, which was an act of the Parliament, look at the Charter of Rights in 1982, and look at any customs that were consistent from 1867 to now, and also use that. That's what they used in 1982 before we had the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. They said to the Prime Minister, you can't do this because every custom and convention since 1867, when changes were going to be made that were fundamental and affected the provinces as well as the federal government, you sat down and talked about it all together, provinces and the federal government. You couldn't do it unilaterally. Very important to remember. But we now have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms in which a lot of rights and freedoms are detailed out there. And my contention today, to bring it right up to date to this very day, my contention is that what the government of BC and all the provinces are doing as it relates to the pandemic, not that the pandemic is not a serious illness or anything, nobody denies that, but of course 99.7% of the population recover below the age of 70, and even over 70, it's 97%. So it's hardly a pandemic in the historic sense that you've got masses of people all over the country dying in the streets or whatever, and hundreds of thousands and so on dying. There's a big recovery on this. So my contention is that the governments of Canada, both federal and provincial, panicked. They panicked. And they went ahead and used fear against the people unnecessarily and brought in measures which they didn't follow the Constitution, on which they didn't follow the Constitution. There is a freedom of assembly. There is a freedom of association in Section 2 of the Constitution. There is a freedom of conscience, religion, freedom of expression, all in Section 2 of the Constitution. Well, we know from the stuff that's been brought in that assembly and association has been put by the wayside. And then we go to Section 6 of the Constitution, and it talks about mobility, your right to travel anywhere in Canada, your right to leave Canada. And most importantly, for people across the country who are losing their jobs, there's a right to pursue a livelihood anywhere in Canada. That is being violated as we speak. We have friends. We have friends who've lost their job. We have friends who've left the country because they lost their job and have gone to Mexico. So we're losing people to other countries because of what's happening here. They didn't follow the right procedures. And then Section 7 of the Constitution talks about life, liberty, and the security of the person. Security of the person, which means that you can't touch my body unless I give informed consent. Well, the governments of Canada today are coercing people, threatening people with their jobs if they don't get vaccinated. This is against the Constitution. This is against the security of the person. And finally, in Section 15, the Constitution Act and the Charter of Rights and Freedom talks about equality before the law. We're all equal before the law. Well, we're not all equal before the law now. Here in Parksville, there's only certain places I'm allowed to go. Other people are allowed to go all over. So there is a difference there's a division in our society today, whereas certain people are considered not as good as other people. That's not equality before the law.
Yeah.
So here are the sections I just outlined briefly to try to give people an understanding of why I'm saying what I'm saying. Now, the big argument is, and some people there are ready, I'm sure, as I was in Nanaimo last night doing a community meeting, explaining all of this, and they were jumping in their seats to ask me a question. And the question was, hey, Brian, hey, Mr. Peckford, hey, former Premier, I know you know a lot about this stuff, but how about Section 1 of the Charter? How about Section 1? Because Section 1 says these rights and freedoms that I just outlined can be put one side or overridden. And that's true, but there are 4 tests that anybody who's going to override, and that would be a government, any government is going to override these rights and freedoms that they have to meet. 4 tests. One is that you must demonstrably justify what you're doing, not just justify it. You must demonstrably justify it, which means you've really got to go out of your way and show facts and figures in order to demonstrably justify your actions. That's number 1. Number 2, you must do it by law. And a lot of what the government's doing is by regulation right now, under an existing law, not by a new law. Well, this says by law. In other words, a new law. You've got to go back to Parliament, which they haven't done in many cases, okay? So you've got to do it by law. Number 3, it has to be reasonable, within reasonable limits. A lot of this stuff is not within reasonable limits. They don't meet that test. And finally, all of what you do, governments, must be consistent with a free and democratic society. Now you look at those 4 tests and you tell me, I can't find any study done by any government in Canada. I can't find any cost benefit analysis or any report that any government has done, federal or provincial, to meet those tests. There isn't one report to defend their position. So they violated the Constitution because they haven't met Section 1 either. And that's my argument. If they had, perhaps I'd say in the first 90 days of the pandemic, yes, people panicked, and perhaps we all panicked. And I can forgive some overreach by the governments for that first 90 or 100 days. But after that, it was clear that this was not the kind of pandemic and fear-mongering that was justified. They should have tailored, it became clear that most of the problems were in the nursing homes and long-term homes, right? That, you've got to really target your measures. That's what the Great Barrington Declaration says later in the year. These top experts in the world came out with the Great Barrington Declaration, which said target where the problem is. Yeah. It's in nursing homes, because a lot of these nursing homes didn't even have proper ventilation. Still don't. Every time I go into a hospital or long-term nursing home, I come out and I'm all sniffed up. I'm sniffed up while I'm up there, because you go in some of these rooms, there's hardly any ventilation. I try to open the window every time I go in to try to get some air in the room, because that's what, that's how germs, right, populate, is when you don't have good ventilation. So they should have started to tailor their measures to meet where the renal disease was and allow the rest of the people to continue to participate in the economy, like Sweden has done so successfully, like Florida has done so successfully. So I understand, having been a premier, yes, you can, and often governments overreact. We're doing it again now on this variant that's around. This variant is not serious at all. People of Africa, I saw a doctor on last night, live, not taped, live, saying, nobody's gone to hospital here in this country as related to this new variant. And yet all of these governments around the world are going like crazy over something they really don't know anything about. The other problem you have in this situation is that then they started to really push the vaccinations. Well, here we have a product that hasn't been finished clinical trials until 2023, that the people who produce the products are not going to stand behind them. They got complete legal immunity, and we don't know what's in them.
Yeah.
And so, you know, that to me, as a person who tries to read and be reasonable about things, is not a reasonable thing. So the governments, in my view, have not met the tests in order to follow the Constitution. They're breaking the Constitution. And two, we're dealing with a product to try to respond to this, besides all the lockdowns. And I just published on my blog yesterday 400 studies that put out by Dr. Alexander of McMaster University through the Brownstone Institute. People can go into my blog or go into the Brownstone Institute and find the list of 400 studies, all of which show that the lockdowns, the masks, are not working. As a matter of fact, in many cases, they are counterproductive and are hindering our health. Dr. Allen of Simon Fraser University has come out with a study that none of the media has carried, showing that the cure is worse than the disease. So for all these reasons, we are found ourselves in a very deep dilemma. I think what has happened, there's been sort of a mass psychosis. When the fear started back in March 2020, a lot of people really believed it all, and later came out and it was shown that that fear mongering wasn't right. That guy in Oxford who said we're going to be millions die and all the rest of it, he had to retract all of that. So all the fear was based upon false predictions. But the people had already entered the fear mode and they haven't got out of it since. And so we are not operating in a rational way as a democratic government today. And I must stand up for that sacred document, for that supreme law, which we are now as a country violating, and our democracy declines as a result of that. And so civic engagement must now happen. We must stand up and be counted in this very, very difficult time for our country.
Well, Brian, thank you so much for that good explanation of how we came to have the charter and what the charter should mean to Canadians and how it's being violated. Were there any, when the charter was patriated, the Constitution was patriated, what aspects of the document at that time did you have concerns with? And I know that ultimately your work helped it to come into being. There must have been aspects that you were concerned about.
We were always concerned about, and the reason why Section 1 got put in the beginning, somebody said, well, why did you put it in the beginning? Well, it just so happens that as we look around the world, it's so difficult to change the Constitution, so difficult to even get the first ministers to sit down. We know today that if anybody tried to change the Constitution, it wouldn't happen, right? You need a majority of the provinces and the federal government on side just to sit down, okay, to talk about it. And you need 7 out of 10 of the provinces and over 50% of the population to make any big changes. So the chances of making a change are very difficult. So this was a very historic time.
Yeah.
So we had to look at it in this light. And we had, of course, in our background, the business of the Quebec crisis back when the War Measures Act came in, right? Which shouldn't have really came in either. That was an overstep, an overreach by the government. Once again, a bit of fear mongering. It all happened in one little cell in Quebec. It never happened all over Quebec even, you know. But that's for another time. But by the same token, we were aware that, you know, the way Russia and China and all the rest of them are acting, we could get into a warlike situation. And because the Constitution wasn't going to be able to be opened very quick, we knew this, that we should have to put something like Section 1 in there, that it was possible. But the context was war and insurrection. The context was not a pandemic where 99.9% of the population under 70 recover. That's not a war. That's not an insurrection. Now, perhaps we should have put in there, right, that this applies to just war and insurrection. But you remember, the courts get to interpret all of this.
Yeah.
So they could also, you know, mess up on war and insurrection. But we thought that even in a war and insurrection, the 4 tests still had to be met. The 4 tests still had to be met. So we thought that was sufficient. We thought that was sufficient because one just assumed, right, that if you're going to put these wonderful rights and freedoms in a constitution, not an act of parliament, a national document, not a federal document, a national document. That's what a constitution is. People get confused about that. A federal act is for the federal parliament and whatever it applies to, right? A constitution is for everybody.
No, I heard a discussion.
Yeah. I think that's very interesting to say. So that's what our context was. And when I, over the next several months, signed my name to an affidavit, which lawyers are after me to do now that are going to court against the governments, that's what I'm going to be saying. That's what I'm going to be saying. Our idea at the time, when we didn't think we had to put in war and insurrection, given the 4 tests that we had there as well, that anything to try to override this must be very, very serious. And we thought those 4 tests demonstrated how serious it must be.
Yeah.
So if you ask me, I suppose going back, you could have put in there just war and insurrection if you wanted to, but we didn't think at the time that that was necessary because those big 4 tests are there, and having it in the Constitution, and no, it couldn't have been changed very easily, that would suffice in a reasonable framework of any government. And remember, we put in the free and democratic society. The 4th test is a free and democratic society. We're still talking about it being a democracy.
Right.
We were still talking about it being free.
Yeah. I heard a discussion the other day, excuse me, from some American historians who said that during the American Revolution, and of course George Washington's troops were battered and straggling and fighting cold, disease and everything. There were 2 epidemics that took place while he was trying to fight that battle. A lot of his soldiers died, or sometimes they couldn't move because so many were sick. And yet, later on, when they drafted their constitution, they did not include any exemption from the rights of the people based on. They didn't even include the word epidemic or pandemic in there because they worked their way through that. And I've pointed out the Spanish flu of 1918. During that time, we weren't paying healthy people to sit on the couch. We were, fighting and winning the First World War. So certainly the level of this pandemic, I think you're right. It's a pandemic of fear, really, and it has been used to manipulate the people of Canada, manipulate and intimidate. And unfortunately, we're on a precipice now. So many of the people have been backed into a corner that it takes courageous people like you, leaders, to step forward to encourage other people to say, yes, we've won tough battles before and we can win this one.
Yeah, and freedom always comes at a cost. I mean, democracy is very fragile. The majority of the globe today, the majority of the people who live on the globe today don't live under a democracy. That's how fragile it is. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's how since Socrates, since Solon's laws, right? In Greece in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, where they had a tiny democracy for a while in Athens, right? How fragile it is. All through the Roman Empire. It was only during the time of Cicero that you had any semblance even of democracy where people could go to the Senate and he could argue on their behalf and others like him, right? And then you had go through all of the Middle Ages, which was all authoritarian governments, right? If there was any government at all. And then we came out of that into the Renaissance and Reformation, freedom, liberty, right? We had Voltaire, we had Montesquieu, we had a lot of great thinkers, Francis Bacon, all the way through. And then suddenly we came out of this morass and started to form nation states. And France got formed, and Germany got formed, and Italy got formed, and so on, right? And with those states came constitutions, right? And people fought for not only having a nation state, but having rights and freedoms within that nation state. It comes with a price, right? And so we've got to take a look at this. And the same way with Canada got formed in 1867, later than a lot of these other countries, because we were just being colonized and the like. But over time, we developed a system somewhat similar to England's. And I mean, look at the Magna Carta, 1215. And even the nobles, even the wealthy, wanted everybody to have basic rights and rights before the courts. The nobles did.
Yeah.
The wealthy, the oligarchs of today, right? The Jeff Bezos of today, right? And the Microsoft guy, the Gates of today, and the Soroses of today. Well, they were the nobles of that time. And here is Gates and Soros not even living up to what the nobles did in 1215. The nobles said the individuals had rights. And here's these guys taking that away from us and trying to put us into some kind of a global government where you and I have absolutely no say.
Yeah, and that's the scariest thing I think about what's going on is the censorship of information. First of all, in the mainstream media, which unfortunately is being paid for by the Liberal government, or the ones that are going along with Mr. Trudeau, the current Trudeau, are being subsidized, and that has to affect the way that they report things.
$600 million.
Yeah,
$600 million has gone out to the media of this country over the last few years. And in December 2020, all of the major news organizations of the world got together and signed what they mistakenly called, because they wanted people to believe in it, the Trusted News Initiative. What was the Trusted News Initiative? It was a document that they signed which said, we're not going to say anything negative about the pandemic or about the vaccine.
Wow.
There's all of this disinformation. Here was these independent think tanks from all over the world producing good, independent scientific information to show that lockdowns don't work, right? That masks are very problematic, and now it is known that they even hurt children and other people who have any kind of a breathing problem, right? You're going to get hurt by wearing these masks. So they signed this. And who signed it? CBC signed it. NBC, CBS, ABC, Reuters, Associated Press, BBC, and all the major news organizations in Europe. And where does the small publication get its news from? Its national and international news from? They get it from these sources. Right. So these sources have already censored. Yeah. So what you get in your local paper on national and international news is already censored.
Yeah, and of course the big news channels are heavily subsidized, not subsidized, but their advertising revenue comes largely from pharmaceutical companies. And so they really are in between a rock and a hard place. They've gotten themselves there, but they don't see, there may be some honest people in there who would like to do something different, but when they start to do so, they're the people who are the accountants in the organization say, no, you can't do that. We can't afford to lose these advertisers. So
absolutely. And Pfizer's been in court more times than they've been out of court, over the years. Pfizer has. I mean, billions of dollars in payments they had to pay out to stop the court from going ahead, doing out of court settlements, and over 1 to 2 billion in court. So this is the people who are producing one of these vaccines, who's been in the court more than they've been out of court. Who've been negotiating with people who have taken action against them, endlessly for the last decade or two. And as far as Moderna goes, of course, they have never had a vaccine come to market. This is the first time. And yet it comes to market in less than a year, when most vaccines take 3 to 4 to 5 years, because you want to see what the impact is medium and long term, not just for the first month or 6 months after you take this thing, but long term, so that you know it's safe for the public. Now we have over 30,000 dead in the US and Europe, just Western Europe, 30,000 dead. This is the reports from government agencies, and over, I forget how many million now, about 2.5 million injured from the VAERS reporting system of the United States and the UDRA vigilance system of Europe. And these are both government agencies, and it's just self-reporting. So Harvard did a study to show that what these agencies are reporting is about 1/10 of the total.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
About 10%. So you can quite honestly say that 30,000 is a lot more.
Yeah.
Almost 10 times more.
a specific instance of harm that is not being talked about by those who influence so much public opinion is stillbirths, miscarriages, problems with pregnancies. And
Exactly.
so their testing period was shorter than a pregnancy, and yet they're coming out and saying this is safe for a pregnant woman to take. And
That's a
very
very,
sadly,
very good point. That's an extremely good point. I'm glad you raised that. Dr. Bridle of the University of Guelph was one of the first with the Japanese researchers to report that this jab that you usually get in the muscle in your arm, which is only supposed to sort of stay there and not go throughout your whole body, actually goes throughout your whole body. And what he pointed out several months ago now, I spoke to him, had communication with him, and was that it does go through all your body. And one of the places that it goes in particular in a woman is it affects her ovaries. It affects her ability to reproduce, and why you're seeing these stillbirths. And that's known now, and he's one of the leading people in this field in the world, not just Canada, in the world. He was negotiating this research with the Japanese and other researchers across the world. Nobody has contradicted his research. Not one person has contradicted his research. And there it is standing there. And as you say, stillbirths are occurring at a larger rate than ever before, and yet nobody wants to do anything about it. Everything is silent and everything is hunky-dory. You know, it's amazing.
Yeah. There's like lemmings, I guess. People are or a herd. You know, it's this herd mentality. They talk about herd immunity, but I'm more concerned about herd mentality. That people are blindly or mindlessly rushing.
Absolutely.
And I guess as long as they keep the fear up, people will continue to act.
Yeah, you know, along comes this variant out of Africa and gives them another push on their fear. You know, it's crazy. So that people's Christmases are not going to be the same as they normally were.
Yeah.
And it's an awful situation. And you know, I said last night in Nanaimo, as this thing moves on and we're being restricted so much, it does remind you of the early 30s. When the Nazi people came to power, while there was still a legitimate government, they gradually brought in measures, and it was very gradual because it never really dawned on anyone until 1938 or 39 of what was going on. So from 1931 to 1938, the people of Germany still thought everything was fine. Oh yeah, but, and then finally the but was, wow, they're taking people away and putting them in camps. And so this is the dangerous slope that we're following. You know, that kind of mentality is what we're following here, and it's very dangerous. And I mentioned last night in Nanaimo, which I just read the other day, which I had forgotten to mention, one of Hitler's chief ways to do this media, he provided a radio to every family in Germany. Radio, like television and the internet is today, was the chief source of communication. And people would listen to the radio for the news. Who controlled the news?
Yeah,
Hitler did. So they were persuaded and bought hook, line, and sinker what they thought they could trust. Today, that's what the majority of people are doing through the internet and through the television, are buying what the government is selling without, you know, a shot being fired or without any criticism, because they're only painting one side of the story, their side of the story. So that's dangerously familiar. The technology might have changed, but the propaganda tactics that are used are exactly the same.
Well, you're exactly right. You know, I don't want to be presumptuous on your time here, but I had two more questions about the charter specifically, and I really appreciate the light you're shedding on current events here. That's so critical. But one question is about the notwithstanding clause and how you see that. The federal government, as far as I know, has never used that, but Quebec has used it. And the other question is about the preamble, which we in the Christian Heritage Party look at the preamble quite a bit, and says the supremacy of God and the rule of law. That and of course the Supreme Court has tended to treat that as, well, it's only the preamble, not really a part of the document, so they can ignore it. And that really troubles me, because the preamble says whereas, and it seems like everything else from the charter flows out of that, or should flow out of that. So maybe your comments on those two.
Oh, absolutely. I want to give comments on both, and I'll deal with the last one first, because it was just last, and that was totally deliberate on our part, and it is part of the Constitution. By the way, if you go to other Supreme Court of Canada decisions, you'll find preambles talked about in other acts in other parts of the Constitution. So this business of trying to say that it's not really part of the Constitution is hogwash. They've used preambles themselves in determining different decisions. So it is just as much a part of the Constitution as a charter or any other part. So let's put that to bed right now. This is a deliberate act of omission. It's an error of omission by any court who does not accept that part of the Constitution is the preamble. As you say, as you clearly say, everything that comes after is part of whereas, and the supremacy of God and the rule of law. And of course, both of these are being hammered pretty hard right now by the way they've gone about this pandemic tactics. Sure, they should react to the so-called pandemic or the epidemic or the virus that we have, but react in a way which is consistent with the supremacy of God and the rule of law. That's what they're supposed to do. And I'm going to start using that in my speeches from now on. People have brought it up to me, and I have not emphasized it as much as I should. And I'm sorry for that. And I will, from this day forward, all the speeches that I do, and I've got 3 more coming up, 1 more in Parksville, 2 in Victoria, and on my online platforms like this, I got a whole bunch of interviews coming up like this one. I will definitely mention that whereas section, and I have overlooked it. I've mentioned it a few times in my, when I'm detailing something, but I should highlight it, and I will highlight it from here on. Okay, that's the first one.
Okay.
Your other question is about the notwithstanding clause. Point number 1, everything that's negotiated between parties is a compromise. This is also this Constitution Act 1982 is compromised too. And that was one of the most difficult things we had to deal with. But there was because we did not, I guess, largely because we did not trust the federal government, because they tried to unilaterally do this themselves on the Constitution itself. And so we saw that there were going to be times when the federal government would be starting to do things using the Constitution as an excuse to do things which may harm BC, not Newfoundland, may harm Saskatchewan, not Nova Scotia, and so on, where they had unique circumstances. I remember this back when we were talking about training across Canada, and the federal government were giving out training funds through their manpower department. And suddenly Newfoundland got cut off from training for fish plant workers, right out of the blue. Okay, the training program came out and they allocated money to all the provinces. And we had a lot of training programs in our vocational schools, which were training marine, right? People, fish plant workers, right? Had the quality control, right? Measures. How are fish plant workers supposed to operate within this environment? But the training programs to be financed were taken away by the federal government. They had financed it the year before, but this year suddenly they didn't. So here was a situation, right, where we were being treated differently than the rest of Canada, because our fishery was more dominant in our economy than it was in most other economies. Even Nova Scotia and PEI, where agriculture is big and other things, didn't have the same impact upon people as did the fishery in Newfoundland. At that time, the fishery in Newfoundland, during my time, was the chief employer of people in the province. So here's an example of what can happen. And so that's why that was put in there, because there was this ongoing skepticism of the federal government's overreach, sometimes using other parts of the BNA Act, right? The good government section, right? And other, in the Commerce Clause and so on, to do things which would apply to all of Canada, which we could then opt out of for a period of time, but we could only do it for 5 years. We had to go through our own parliament and get it passed. And then if it was going to go longer than 5 years, it would have to be reintroduced again. So there were checks and balances on the notwithstanding clause. But that was the idea behind it and why it was brought in. Because very often we're not as trusting of the federal government, giving their history of even trying to take us out of the situation as related to the Constitution itself. So that's why it was put in.
Well, thank you. Great. Well, Brian, you've been very generous with your time. What else would you like to be sure that our listeners and viewers know before we close off this?
Thank you very much for this. And I'll be short, but I hope people will listen to this. A democracy is only healthy as long as citizens are involved. As civic participation goes down, so does a democracy. And that's what's happened now. We have got to re-energize ourselves. Today, I think on the Parksville, Qualicum area, as a result of my speech last week, a group of people are getting together and picketing around their MLA's office. You are part of breaking our Constitution, Mr. MLA, Miss MLA, Mrs. MLA. And if we can get enough people to legitimately, in a civil, peaceful way, demonstrate to make their points at all the MLA's offices, all the ministers' offices around BC, of which there's a lot. Every MLA now has an office in their constituency to protest, to let them know that the people are not happy with the way they are proceeding on this. This could have an impact. This could have an impact. Also contact your MP, write your MP, write your MLA, write the Prime Minister, write the Premier. I know a lot of it seems hopeless. Like, for example, in my case, I wrote our MLA in May. This is in November, 2 weeks ago, I got an answer back from his assistant.
Wow.
June, July, August, September, October, November. 6 months later, I get and I'm only 10 miles away from the MLA's office.
Yeah.
He never even picked up the phone and said, Mr. Peckford, right? You know, as a former premier, I see you've written me, you know, and you have some concerns, you know, I'd like to hear them, right? Yeah. But not only did he not do that, he didn't even sign a letter back to me. He had his assistant do it. Well, the assistant is accountable to him. He's accountable to me. Yeah. That's like Bonnie Henry. I tell everybody, don't mention her name again. Mention Health Minister Dix's name. Mention Horgan, the Premier's name, because Bonnie Henry is only a slave to the minister and to the Premier. She's a public servant. She doesn't report to us. She reports to the Premier and to the minister. The people who report to us are the minister and the Premier. They're the ones who got elected. She never got elected, okay? So that's very, very important. So my final message is, please, if you believe like me, that this is a very troublesome time and our freedoms and rights are being, freedoms that we only put in the Constitution 40 years ago are now suddenly being trampled on by the very governments who say they'd like to support the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Then we've got to stand up, because if we don't, and this becomes the norm, the next time something happens, and they can declare it quite easily, whatever they want, and call it an emergency, they have a precedent. This doesn't get overturned. They have a precedent, and democracy, as Canada has known it, will be no more.
Yeah. Well, that's a somber note to end on, but I 100% agree with you, Brian. You've done an amazing job of presenting the facts that people need to know, and giving us some direction to go forward. And everyone out there who's concerned should be getting involved. Now, I'll mention you have a blog as well. Where can people find?
Yes, I really thank you very much for that, because I always forget to mention my own blog. I mentioned it in passing, but I never give its address. Here's its address: www, of course, Peckford, a number 4 and a number 2. That's the year in which I was born. I'm in my 80th year now. So Peckford, Peckford, a number 4, a number 2, dot WordPress, WORDPRESS.com.
Well, thank you very much.
And I post on it every single day. I've already posted 2 articles this morning.
Okay. Well, Brian, you are an inspiration, and we thank you for your work in the past, and for what you're doing today is making a difference, and it will make a difference in the future. So thanks so much.
And thank you for doing what you're doing. This is all very important, and you're part of the solution. And seeing you doing this and contacting me, I really appreciate it for the people in your area, because sometimes we get bogged down with Lower Mainland, or even the Vancouver Island, and we forget about all the rural parts of this province. Being a rural bay boy from Newfoundland, I don't forget about my rural roots. Right. And I know the people of Buckley, Valley, and Skeena area are just as important to our, I know. Yeah. I looked it up, and I know, I drove through there, by the way, years ago, my wife and I, and stayed in various B&Bs and that in the area, so I understand the area. But I'm a rural guy, and that's what the Charter of Rights, you see, Mr. Taylor, is all about. It's all about individuals. It's individual rights and freedoms. I come back to that. It's individuals. People matter. Yeah. Every snowflake is unique, and so is every person. Yeah. And everybody matters. And so the people of your area matter to me. They should matter to every government, because they all count. And that's why I'm so pleased to be on your program. I just don't want to talk to Victoria. I just don't want to talk to Vancouver or Ottawa or Toronto. I want to talk to Skeena, Buckley Valley too.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And God bless you. We look forward to speaking with you again. And hopefully some of these clouds that we're under now will pass and the sun will shine again. And thanks, Brian, so much for joining us.
Thank you so very much. I look forward to talking to you again.
Yeah, all the best.